On a quiet morning in an upscale neighborhood, a routine jog turned into a nightmare. A police officer, blinded by prejudice, forcefully detained a man, kicking him to the ground, humiliating him in front of bystanders. But what he didn't know was that the man he just assaulted was no ordinary citizen. He was the chief of the FBI. Now, the question remains, how will he respond? Will he let it slide? Or will he expose the deep-rooted corruption within the system? This isn't just about one officer. This is about a culture of power, privilege, and unchecked authority, and one man's fight to dismantle it. Stay with us as we unravel a story of justice, accountability, and consequences that no one saw coming. Don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment below. Where are you watching this from? Let's talk about how we can stand against injustice together. The sun had just begun to rise over Centennial Park, casting golden light across the neatly paved walkways, filtering through the rustling leaves of the towering oak trees. For Darius Carter, this was one of the rare moments of peace, a chance to shake off the weight of his responsibilities and clear his mind with an early morning jog. Dressed in a gray athletic shirt and dark jogging pants, he blended in with the usual morning crowd. Dog walkers, elderly couples chatting on park benches, and young athletes pushing their limits. His breathing was steady, his steps rhythmic against the gravel path, until a sharp voice cut through the quiet air. "Stop right there, hands up, and get on your knees." Darius came to a halt, turning toward the voice. Standing before him was a white police officer, tall and broad-shouldered, his buzzed hair catching the sunlight. His uniform was crisp, and the name tag on his chest read, Ryan Gallagher. "Is there a problem, officer?" Darius kept his voice calm, though his sharp eyes assessed the situation instantly. Gallagher stepped closer, his hand resting on the holstered gun at his waist. "Got a report about a suspicious individual wandering around this area." Darius raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? I'm just jogging." The officer let out a dry chuckle, his gaze scanning Darius from head to toe. "Yeah? A guy like you, in this neighborhood, at this hour?" Nearby, a few people slowed their steps, watching the interaction unfold. A teenager discreetly pulled out their phone and started recording, but no one stepped in. Darius inhaled deeply, keeping his tone measured. "You're making a mistake, officer." But Gallagher only smirked, tightening his grip on his holster. "We'll see who's making the mistake." Darius stood his ground, his breath even despite the tension tightening around him. He had faced situations like this before, too many times, but it never got easier. He glanced around, noticing how the casual morning atmosphere had shifted. The park-goers who had once been enjoying their morning routines were now frozen in place, their attention locked onto the confrontation unfolding before them. "Officer," Darius said, keeping his tone level, "I don't know what kind of report you received, but I assure you I'm not doing anything wrong. I live just a few blocks from here." Gallagher let out a sharp laugh, tilting his head as he studied Darius with thinly veiled contempt. "Oh, is that so? Because from where I'm standing, you match the description perfectly." "What description?" Darius asked, his jaw tightening. "A black man, loitering around this area, acting suspicious," Gallagher replied, his voice laced with sarcasm. "That sound familiar to you?" Darius clenched his fists, suppressing the familiar anger bubbling beneath the surface. He had worked too hard, come too far, to be reduced to just another statistic in a racially charged stop. "I wasn't loitering, I was jogging. That's not a crime." Gallagher scoffed. "Oh, yeah? Then why do you look so nervous?" Darius shook his head, exhaling sharply. "I'm not nervous, officer. I'm frustrated. because I know exactly how this goes, and I know exactly what kind of man you are." Gallagher's smirk faltered for a brief second before he stepped closer, his hand now gripping his holster. "Oh, you know me now. That's funny, because I don't think you belong here." The tension in the air thickened. The teenager recording on their phone whispered something to a friend. A woman clutched her dog's leash tighter. A man in a suit stopped mid-stride, his eyes darting between Darius and the officer. "Sir," Darius said slowly, holding up his hands to show he wasn't a threat, "I'm asking you again. What exactly am I being accused of?" "I gave you an order," Gallagher snapped. "And instead of following it, you're running your mouth. That's enough reason for me." Before Darius could respond, Gallagher suddenly lunged forward, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. Pain shot through Darius's shoulder as he stumbled, his knee slamming into the gravel path. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Someone shouted, "Hey!" He didn't do anything. "Stay out of this," Gallagher barked, tightening his grip as he shoved Darius further down. "Stop resisting." Darius gritted his teeth. "I'm not resisting," he growled, his voice low and firm. But Gallagher wasn't listening. With one swift motion, he kicked Darius behind the knee, forcing him fully onto the ground. Gravel scraped against Darius's palms as he braced himself. "This is unnecessary," Darius said through clenched teeth. Gallagher leaned down, his breath hot against Darius's ear. "Men like you always think you're above the law," he hissed. "But you're not, and I'm going to make sure you learn that today." Darius inhaled slowly, steadying his pulse, reminding himself who he was, reminding himself that this man, this officer drunk on power, had no idea who he had just laid hands on. A voice rang out from the crowd. "Let him go. We saw everything." Gallagher ignored them. His grip was bruising now, his pride swelling with each second of exerted dominance. But Darius had had enough. With a controlled, fluid motion, he shifted his weight, rising steadily to his feet. Gallagher stumbled back, startled, but quickly recovered, his hand immediately reaching for his gun. The crowd fell silent. Darius locked eyes with him, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket. Gallagher's fingers twitched on his holster. "Don't do it," Gallagher warned. Darius ignored him, pulling out his wallet with smooth precision. He flipped it open, revealing a golden badge that gleamed under the morning sun. The words etched into it might as well have been a gunshot to Gallagher's ego. The air in the park turned electric. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The teenager holding the phone zoomed in. People murmured, eyes wide, unable to believe what they were seeing. Gallagher's face drained of color. His lips parted, but no words came out. Darius held the badge higher. His voice was calm, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "You just assaulted the chief of the FBI." The power dynamic in that moment flipped in an instant. Gallagher staggered back, his once arrogant stance faltering. His hand twitched away from his gun as realization sank in. The crowd watched, anticipation thick in the air. Darius took a step closer, his voice steady, unshaken. "Now, officer, I suggest you call your supervisor." Captain Monroe's face hardened as he turned toward Darius, forcing a strained smile. "Chief Hayes, let's step aside and handle this privately. I'm sure we can clear up any misunderstandings." Darius narrowed his eyes, reading between the lines. "A misunderstanding?" he echoed, his voice sharp. "Your officer tackled me to the ground, assaulted me, and humiliated me in front of dozens of witnesses, and now you want to handle this privately." Monroe exhaled, clearly struggling to keep his composure in front of the growing crowd. He shot Gallagher a murderous glare before looking back at Darius. "Let's be reasonable. Officer Gallagher didn't know who you were." Darius crossed his arms. "And that's exactly the problem, isn't it?" he said. "Would he have treated me differently if he had? Or would he have treated me differently if I didn't have this badge at all?" A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Monroe stiffened. "Chief, I'm trying to de-escalate here." Darius stepped forward, lowering his voice just enough to make Monroe lean in. "You're trying to cover for your officer, and I need you to hear me clearly. This isn't going away." The flashing lights of news cameras flickered in the distance as a local news van pulled up. Reporters rushed toward the scene, microphones in hand. Monroe's eyes darted toward them, panic flashing across his face. Gallagher finally found his voice, though it was weak. "Sir, I didn't mean—" Darius turned sharply toward him. "You didn't mean to what? Assume I didn't belong here. Assume I was a criminal before I even opened my mouth." Gallagher flinched but said nothing. Monroe straightened his shoulders, trying to regain control. "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be, Chief Hayes. We'll handle this internally." Darius gave him a knowing look. "Internally? Like all the other complaints against this officer? The ones that somehow never resulted in disciplinary action?" Monroe froze. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone yelled, "Expose them!" Darius took a deep breath, then turned to the reporters who were now closing in. "Since the department seems eager to handle this privately, let's make sure the public knows exactly how they do business." Monroe's face turned to stone. He knew in that moment he had lost control of the situation. And for the first time, he looked afraid. The flashing lights of news cameras illuminated the tension-filled scene, their glare reflecting off Captain Monroe's sweat-dotted forehead. His jaw tightened as he stole a glance at the growing crowd, their murmurs turning into a restless buzz. The weight of the moment was pressing down on him, but Darius was far from done. "You want to handle this internally?" Darius said, turning to Monroe. "Fine. But first let's talk about Officer Gallagher's history. The excessive force complaints, the racial profiling allegations, the body cam footage that mysteriously disappeared in prior incidents. Should we discuss that in front of the cameras, Captain?" Monroe's eyes flickered with something between anger and unease. He cleared his throat. "Chief Hayes, this isn't the time or place." Darius took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it sting. "No, Monroe. This is exactly the time and place. Because if I wasn't who I am, I'd be sitting in the back of a patrol car right now. Or worse." Gallagher, still standing rigidly, clenched his fists. "This is ridiculous. I was doing my job." Darius slowly turned to him, his gaze cold and unwavering. Your job was to protect and serve, not profile and assault. But let's get to the real issue. How many other men have you thrown to the ground just because they fit a description? How many of them didn't have a badge to stop you?" Gallagher's face burned red. "I didn't know who you were." "And that's the problem," Darius shot back. "It shouldn't have mattered." Monroe exhaled sharply, stepping between them. "All right, enough. Officer Gallagher, report back to the station immediately." Gallagher opened his mouth as if to protest, but Monroe's glare silenced him. The officer stormed off toward his squad car, his posture tense with anger and humiliation. Darius wasn't finished. "Captain Monroe, this isn't ending here. I'm calling for an official investigation, not just into Gallagher, but into your entire department. Because if this is how you handle accountability, I can only imagine what's been swept under the rug." Monroe's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake, Hayes. You think going after me is going to fix everything? You think tearing this department apart is going to bring justice? Darius stared at him, unblinking. I think justice starts by tearing down the walls that protect men like Gallagher. And if those walls include you, then so be it. Monroe took a step back, his lips pressed into a hard line. He knew there was no coming back from this, not with the cameras rolling, not with the city watching. A moment later, his radio crackled. Captain Monroe, we have media requests coming in from major outlets. What's the official statement? Monroe exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples before clicking the radio. Tell them no comment. Darius smirked. That's fine, because I have plenty to say. And with that, he turned to the cameras, ready to expose the corruption that had thrived in the shadows for far too long. The press conference was over, but the real battle had just begun. Darius sat in a dimly lit conference room inside the FBI field office, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. Across from him sat Captain Monroe, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. Next to him, Officer Gallagher sat stiffly, his hands clasped together, eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Darius leaned forward, his voice calm but sharp. Let's skip the formalities. We both know why we're here. Monroe exhaled through his nose, trying to maintain control. Chief Hayes, I understand that you're upset, but you need to think this through. You're putting your career, and frankly your reputation, at risk by pushing this so hard. Darius let out a dry chuckle. My reputation? Captain, do you hear yourself? This isn't about my reputation. It's about justice. And if my name gets dragged through the mud for standing up against men like Gallagher, then so be it. Gallagher finally spoke, his voice cracking under the weight of the situation. Sir, I didn't mean for things to go this far. Darius turned his gaze on him, his expression unreadable. Gallagher, let me ask you something. If I had been anyone else that day, just another black man jogging in a park, what would have happened? Gallagher swallowed hard, his fingers twitching against the table. I don't know. You do know, Darius said, his voice quiet but laced with steel. You just don't want to say it out loud. Monroe cut in, his frustration bubbling over. All right, that's enough. What do you want, Hayes? You got your press conference. You embarrassed my department. What more do you need? Darius didn't hesitate. I want Gallagher fired, effective immediately. And I want an external review of your entire department. Every complaint, every disciplinary action, every incident that was buried. No more sweeping things under the rug. Monroe's nostrils flared. You're out of your damn mind. Darius leaned back, crossing his arms. Am I? Or are you just scared of what they'll find? Silence stretched between them. Finally, Monroe let out a slow breath. Fine. Gallagher's gone. But don't think for a second that this ends here. Darius stood, straightening his suit. I hope not, because this fight is just getting started. And as he walked out of the room, he knew this wasn't just about Gallagher anymore. This was about an entire system that had been broken for far too long. And now, it was time to tear it down. Darius stepped out of the conference room, his mind still reeling from the confrontation. Gallagher was officially out, but this was just the beginning. He had forced Monroe's hand, but the captain was right about one thing: this fight wasn't over. As he walked through the FBI field office, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from an unknown number. Unknown. You've made some powerful enemies today. Be careful. Darius exhaled sharply, locking his phone. Threats didn't scare him. If anything, They proved he was doing something right. His assistant, Jordan Tate, hurried toward him. "Chief, you need to see this." She handed him a tablet, and he scanned the screen. News reports had already picked up the story. The headline on one of the major networks read, "FBI Chief Confronts Corrupt Police System. Officer Fired After Shocking Racial Profiling Incident." The footage of Gallagher pinning him down, of Monroe's pale face as reporters pressed him for answers, had already gone viral. Social media was ablaze with debates, support, and backlash. Darius sighed. He had expected this. "What's the reaction from D.C.?" he asked. Jordan hesitated. "Mixed. Some officials are calling for deeper investigations into Monroe's department. Others, well, they think you went too far." Darius nodded, unsurprised. "And what about the community?" Jordan smiled slightly. "They're behind you. There's a protest planned outside City Hall tomorrow. People are demanding more resignations." Darius rubbed his temples. He wasn't against public pressure. It was necessary, but he also knew how quickly situations like this could spiral into chaos. He had to handle this the right way. Just then, his office phone rang. Jordan answered, then looked up at him. "It's Gallagher." Darius frowned but nodded. "Put him through." The line clicked. A deep, shaky breath came through the speaker. "Chief Hayes." Gallagher's voice was raw, broken. "I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need to talk." Darius remained silent for a moment before replying. "Why?" "Because you were right," Gallagher admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "About everything. About me, about the system, and I have something you need to see." Darius's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Gallagher hesitated. "Monroe. He's been covering up more than just my actions. He's been protecting guys way worse than me." Darius's grip tightened on the phone. "And now, you suddenly care?" Gallagher let out a humorless laugh. "Number. But I know when I'm the fall guy. Monroe threw me under the bus to save himself, and if he's willing to do that to me, he'll do it to anyone." Darius leaned back in his chair, considering. "All right. Show me what you have." An hour later, Darius sat in a private meeting room, watching as Gallagher slid a flash drive across the table. "Everything's on here," Gallagher muttered. "Internal complaints, falsified reports, even body cam footage that was supposed to be deleted." Darius plugged the drive into his laptop. What he saw made his blood run cold. Evidence of racial profiling, falsified police reports, and cover-ups, years' worth of corruption. He looked up at Gallagher, who wouldn't meet his gaze. "Why are you giving me this?" Gallagher swallowed hard. "Because I don't want to be the guy I was anymore. And because I know that if Monroe goes down, I have a chance to actually make things right." Darius studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, he nodded. "This doesn't erase what you did, but it's a start." Gallagher let out a slow breath, as if he'd been holding it for years. "I know." Darius stood up, gripping the flash drive tightly. "Now, let's take down Monroe." Darius stood outside the courthouse, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. The morning air was crisp, but the energy from the crowd was electric. Protesters gathered on the courthouse steps, their signs raised high. The words "Justice for All," "End Police Corruption," and "Accountability Now" stood out in bold letters. The media had turned the case into national news. Monroe had been suspended pending investigation, and a full-scale federal probe into the department was now underway. Gallagher's files had exposed not only his own wrongdoings, but a pattern of cover-ups that ran deep within the force. It was bigger than one officer, bigger than one department. As Darius walked toward the podium set up for the press, reporters surged forward, microphones raised. "Chief Hayes, what's next?" one of them asked. Darius took a steady breath. "This isn't the end," he said, his voice strong and unwavering. "This is just the beginning." The crowd erupted in applause. A journalist pushed forward. "Some people say you went too far, that you're turning this into a personal vendetta. What do you say to that?" Darius met the reporter's gaze. "Justice isn't personal. It's necessary. And if holding people accountable makes some uncomfortable, then so be it." The protesters cheered again. The city was watching. The country was watching. Darius knew this fight wasn't over. There would be resistance, political pushback, threats from those who thrived in the shadows. But he also knew he wasn't alone. He turned to Jordan, who stood beside him, her expression firm. "They're afraid," she said. "That means you're doing something right." Darius exhaled, allowing himself a small, determined smile. "Then we keep going." And as he stepped away from the podium, he knew this wasn't just about one case. It was about dismantling a system that had protected the wrong people for far too long. This was the start of something bigger, and he wasn't backing down. This story is more than just an isolated incident. It reflects a systemic issue that exists in many communities. It teaches us about the dangers of racial profiling, abuse of power, and the importance of accountability within law enforcement. But beyond the injustice, it also highlights something even more powerful: the impact of standing up for what's right. One of the key takeaways from this story is that silence enables corruption. If no one speaks out, systems of oppression continue to thrive. Whether you're a bystander, a victim, or someone within the system, you have a responsibility to question, challenge, and demand justice when you see wrongdoing. For everyday life, this means recording and reporting misconduct when you witness abuse of power, educating yourself and others about systemic discrimination and policies that enable it, voting for officials who push for police accountability and justice reform, supporting organizations that work to protect civil rights. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with people refusing to accept injustice as the norm. If this story teaches us anything, it's that one person taking a stand can ignite a movement. The question is, will you be that person?